The Battle of Cannae, the Battle of Cannae, fought during the Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage, is often considered one of the greatest military tactics in history. It took place on August 2nd, 216 BCE, and was a complete disaster for the Roman Republic. It's still studied in military academies around the world for its brilliance in strategy, but also for the sheer devastation it caused. At the time, Rome was in the midst of a war with Carthage, led by the brilliant general Hannibal. After a series of victories, Hannibal had invaded Italy, and the Romans were desperate to stop him. The Romans mustered a force of around 80,000 soldiers to confront Hannibal's army of 50,000. On paper, the Romans had a massive advantage in numbers. They thought they could easily overwhelm Hannibal, but they couldn't have been more wrong. Hannibal, a master tactician, understood his enemy's weaknesses. When the Romans arrived at Cannae, they formed a traditional battle formation, with their troops arranged in a long, narrow line. Hannibal, however, used a brilliant strategy, placing his weaker infantry in the center of his formation and his stronger forces on the flanks. As the battle began, the Carthaginian center slowly retreated, luring the Roman forces in. The Romans, eager to push forward, followed the retreating troops, and as they did, they exposed their flanks to Hannibal's stronger forces. The Carthaginian cavalry, which was positioned on the wings, then charged and attacked the Roman forces from behind. The Romans were trapped in a pincer movement, and despite their numerical advantage, they were encircled on all sides. The battle turned into a massacre. Of the 80,000 Roman soldiers, it's estimated that around 50,000 to 70,000 were killed or captured in a single day. The Romans lost nearly all their soldiers, and Hannibal's victory was total. The Battle of Cannae is remembered for its devastating impact on Rome. It shook the Roman Republic to its core and is still seen as one of the greatest tactical victories in military history. But while Hannibal's victory was impressive, it did not lead to the ultimate success of Carthage in the war. The Romans, though reeling from the loss, adapted and learned from their mistakes, ultimately leading to their victory in the Second Punic War. Still, Cannae serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence and poor planning, even when you have the advantage. Napoleon's invasion of Russia. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, embarked on what would become one of the most infamous military blunders in history, the invasion of Russia. At the time, Napoleon controlled much of Europe, but he was facing growing resistance to his dominance, particularly from Russia. His plan was to defeat Russia once and for all, solidify his control over Europe, and continue his expansionist goals. But what followed was a catastrophic failure that would alter the course of history. Napoleon gathered one of the largest armies ever assembled at the time, known as the Grande Armée, totaling over 600,000 men. The French army marched into Russia in June 1812, confident that they would quickly defeat the Russians, who had an army of around 200,000 men. But Napoleon underestimated not only the size of Russia, but also the harsh conditions of the Russian terrain. The Russian strategy was one of retreat. Instead of engaging Napoleon in a large-scale battle, the Russians gradually pulled back, burning villages and destroying resources as they went, a tactic known as scorched earth. Napoleon's army, stretched thin, followed the Russians deeper into the vast Russian wilderness, but they were unable to maintain their supply lines. The further they advanced, the more difficult it became to find food, shelter, and reinforcements. Then came the Russian winter. Napoleon's army, already exhausted from the long march and plagued by disease, began to suffer in the brutal cold. By the time they reached Moscow, the Russians had abandoned the city, leaving it in flames. Napoleon, now without a clear victory and facing starvation and dwindling morale, made the fateful decision to retreat. The retreat was disastrous. The French army, poorly equipped for the Russian winter, was decimated by the cold, starvation, and Russian attacks. Thousands of soldiers perished, and by the time Napoleon and his remaining forces finally crossed the border into France, fewer than 100,000 men were left. Napoleon's invasion of Russia had been a catastrophic failure. This blunder marked the beginning of Napoleon's downfall. His losses in Russia weakened his military power and emboldened his enemies. The Russian campaign exposed the limitations of Napoleon's empire and showed that even the most powerful ruler could be undone by nature and poor strategic planning. It's one of the greatest examples of overconfidence, poor logistical planning, and underestimating the enemy in military history. The Charge of the Light Brigade. On October 25, 1854, during the Crimean War, one of the most infamous military blunders in history took place: the Charge of the Light Brigade. This charge, which took place at the Battle of Balaclava, would go down in history not for its success, but for its tragic and unnecessary loss of life. The charge of the Light Brigade was the result of a miscommunication between the British commanders during the battle. The British Army was engaged in a complex series of maneuvers against the Russian forces. The Light Brigade, a unit of cavalry, was tasked with advancing toward Russian artillery positions to prevent them from firing on the British lines. However, due to a misinterpreted order, the Light Brigade charged directly toward the Russian artillery, rather than engaging the artillery positions from a different angle. The British commanders were unaware of the confusion until it was too late. The Light Brigade, under the command of Lord Cardigan, galloped directly into the heavily fortified Russian guns. The cavalry, armed only with sabers, was met with devastating Russian cannon and rifle fire. The charge was a disaster. Despite the bravery of the men involved, the Light Brigade suffered heavy casualties, with over 100 killed and more than 200 wounded, all for nothing. The miscommunication that led to this charge became a symbol of military incompetence. It's often remembered as a heroic but futile act of bravery, especially considering the soldiers had no chance of success due to the confusion. The charge didn't change the outcome of the battle, but it demonstrated the tragic consequences of poor leadership and breakdowns in communication during wartime. The Battle of Agincourt. The Battle of Agincourt, fought on October 25, 1415 during the 100 Years' War, is remembered as a battle of David versus Goliath proportions, where an outnumbered English army, led by King Henry V, achieved a stunning victory over the French. What makes this battle so fascinating is not just the underdog victory, but the remarkable military strategy that led to it. The French army, led by a series of noble generals, greatly outnumbered the English, with estimates suggesting that the French forces numbered around 25,000 to 30,000, compared to Henry VIII's army of just 6,000 to 9,000 men. The French, confident in their numerical superiority, believed they could easily crush the English forces. However, Henry V had a brilliant plan. The English were equipped with longbowmen, a weapon that had revolutionized warfare. The French knights, heavily armored and mounted, had been the dominant force in medieval warfare for centuries. But the terrain at Agincourt was muddy and narrow, which neutralized the advantage of the French cavalry. The English longbowmen, positioned behind a line of sharp stakes, launched a devastating barrage of arrows at the advancing French. The arrows struck the French knights and soldiers with deadly precision, causing chaos and confusion among the ranks. The French knights, bogged down in the mud, struggled to advance, while the English archers continued their relentless assault. As the French lines faltered, Henry VI's men launched a counterattack, and the French were crushed. Estimates of French casualties vary, but it's believed that at least 10,000 French soldiers were killed, while the English lost fewer than 500 men. Agincourt was a crushing defeat for the French, and it solidified Henry V's reputation as a military genius. The battle showed the power of innovation, how the English used their longbowmen to defeat a far superior force and completely change the course of the 100 Years' War. The Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union from 1942 to 1943, is one of the most brutal and pivotal battles in history. It marked the turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front and is remembered for its immense human cost and the complete failure of the German strategy. Adolf Hitler had set his sights on Stalingrad, a vital industrial city in southern Russia. Capturing the city would not only cripple Soviet production, but would also serve as a psychological blow to the USSR. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, advanced toward the city with around 250,000 troops. The Soviets, led by General Vasily Chuikov, fiercely resisted and defended every inch of the city. The battle quickly descended into brutal urban warfare, with soldiers fighting for control of individual buildings, streets, and even rooms. The Germans had to deal with constant bombardments, sniper fire, and Soviet counterattacks, making any advances slow and costly. However, the real blunder came when Hitler refused to allow Paulus to retreat. As the battle raged on, the Germans were stretched thin, facing starvation, the harsh Russian winter, and a lack of reinforcements. Meanwhile, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus in November 1942, encircling the German Sixth Army in a massive pincer movement. Trapped in the city, the Germans had no escape. Hitler's refusal to allow Paulus to retreat and his insistence on capturing Stalingrad at any cost ultimately led to disaster. By February 1943, after months of brutal fighting, the German forces were forced to surrender. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers were either killed or captured, and the battle caused severe damage to the morale of the Nazi army. Stalingrad marked the beginning of a long, relentless Soviet push westward, and it severely weakened Nazi Germany's military capabilities. The blunder of underestimating Soviet resilience and the failure to adapt tactics to the brutal conditions of the Russian front turned Stalingrad into a decisive moment in Lobhuis that sealed the fate of Nazi Germany. The Battle of the Somme, World War I, infamous for its massive casualties, and the Battle of the Somme, fought from July to November 1916, epitomizes the horrific costs of war during this period. It was one of the bloodiest battles in history, with over 1 million soldiers wounded or killed. Yet it was, in many ways, a military blunder due to poor planning and outdated tactics. The battle began as a joint British and French offensive against the German Empire along the Western Front. The Allies' primary goal was to relieve pressure on the French forces at Verdun and break through the German defenses. The plan was to use heavy artillery bombardments to destroy the German defenses, followed by infantry assaults to capture the German lines. However, the heavy artillery bombardments, which lasted for a week before the infantry attack, failed to achieve their goal. The German soldiers had dug deep into well-fortified trenches and underground bunkers, rendering the bombardment largely ineffective. The British commanders, led by General Haig, underestimated the Germans' ability to withstand the bombardment and overestimated the effectiveness of their own troops. On the first day of the battle, July 1st, 1916, the British launched their attack. Despite the artillery barrage, the Germans were largely unharmed, and the British infantry walked straight into a deadly storm of machine gun fire. Over 57,000 British soldiers were casualties on that single day, making it the bloodiest day in British military history, and it only got worse from there. The battle dragged on for 4 months, with the Allies making slow, costly advances, but they never fully broke through the German lines. In the end, the Allies gained only about 7 miles of territory, while the Germans also suffered heavy casualties, but not nearly as devastating as the British losses. The Battle of the Somme is remembered as a tragic example of the failure of traditional tactics in modern warfare. The overwhelming reliance on infantry charges against machine guns and barbed wire resulted in one of the highest casualty rates in military history, with little to show for the immense sacrifices. The failure to adapt to modern warfare and the inability to properly assess the enemy's strength made the Battle of the Somme a blunder of catastrophic proportions. The Battle of the Bulge, one of the most significant battles of World War II, and certainly one of the biggest blunders of the war, was the Battle of the Bulge. Fought from December 1944 to January 1945. This was Adolf Hitler's last major offensive against the Allies on the Western Front. The battle, which took place in the dense forests of the Ardennes in Belgium, was intended to split the Allied forces, recapture the vital port city of Antwerp, and turn the tide of the war in Germany's favor. Hitler's plan involved a surprise attack against a thinly stretched Allied line. The German forces, numbering around 200,000 soldiers, launched their assault on the unsuspecting American forces, who were spread out along a wide front. Initially, the Germans made significant progress, creating a bulge in the Allied lines, which gave the battle its name. However, the Germans severely underestimated the strength of the Allies' resistance and overextended their supply lines. The harsh winter weather, which grounded air support and further slowed logistics, worked against the Germans, as did the fierce resistance from the American troops. The Germans also failed to anticipate the resilience of the Allied forces, who quickly regrouped and counterattacked. Despite initial successes, the German forces were unable to break through the Allied lines. The Americans, aided by British and Canadian forces, mounted a strong defense, and the battle turned into a war of attrition. By January 1945, the Germans had been pushed back, and their forces were severely weakened. The Battle of the Bulge, while initially successful for the Germans, ended in failure and was a devastating blow to their military capabilities. The blunder came from Hitler's overestimation of the German army's ability to launch and sustain such an offensive, and his underestimation of the Allies' ability to quickly regroup and respond. The battle marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, and it significantly weakened their ability to continue fighting on both the Eastern and Western fronts. The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is a prime example of a military blunder born from a combination of miscalculations, misunderstandings, and political interference. The United States, engaged in the Cold War, feared the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, and Vietnam became the epicenter of this ideological battle. The US believed that a quick and decisive victory over the Communist North would end the spread of communism in the region. However, they underestimated the resilience of the North Vietnamese and the complexity of the situation. The US military, the most powerful in the world at the time, was poorly suited for the type of warfare they encountered in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and the Viet Cong, the communist insurgents, used guerrilla tactics, blending into the civilian population and launching surprise attacks from tunnels and hidden positions. The US military relied heavily on conventional warfare tactics, including airstrikes, artillery, and large-scale troop deployments, but these methods were ineffective against the unconventional tactics of the North Vietnamese. Additionally, the American military was not prepared for the difficult jungle terrain and the extreme heat and humidity that drained their morale and supplies. The US also failed to win the support of the South Vietnamese population, who were often caught between the NVA, VC, and American forces. The war also became increasingly unpopular at home, as images of brutal combat and civilian casualties were broadcasted on television. The failure to adapt to guerrilla warfare, the overestimation of military power, and the underestimation of the enemy's determination led to an eventual withdrawal of American forces. The Vietnam War ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon and the unification of Vietnam under communist rule. It remains one of the most significant military blunders in US history and a sobering lesson on the limitations of military power in asymmetric warfare. The Korean War, which began in 1950, was another example of a conflict where military blunders and underestimation of the enemy played a major role in its outcome. The war was fought between the communist North Korea, backed by China and the Soviet Union, and the South Korean government, supported by the United States and its allies. It was part of the larger Cold War struggle between communism and democracy, and it began when North Korean forces, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, invaded South Korea. Initially, the North Koreans made significant progress, quickly capturing Seoul and pushing South Korean forces to the brink of collapse. The US quickly intervened under the banner of the United Nations, and General Douglas MacArthur was appointed to lead the UN forces. The US military responded with a counteroffensive, notably the daring amphibious assault at Incheon, which turned the tide of the war and pushed the North Koreans back. However, MacArthur made a significant blunder when he decided to pursue the North Korean forces deep into China. The US had been expecting China to stay out of the conflict, but this was a miscalculation. When UN forces pushed too close to the Chinese border, China intervened, sending massive numbers of troops to push the UN forces back. The result was a stalemate that lasted for the next few years. MacArthur's overconfidence and failure to consider the broader geopolitical implications of China's involvement led to a major shift in the war. Instead of quickly defeating the North Koreans, the conflict turned into a protracted and bloody stalemate. The war ended in 1953 with an armistice, but no official peace treaty was signed, leaving the Korean peninsula divided at the 38th parallel, a situation that persists to this day. This conflict exemplified the limits of military power and the catastrophic consequences of underestimating an enemy's willingness to fight. The Korean War's failure to achieve a decisive victory highlighted the dangers of escalating a conflict without understanding the full range of regional dynamics. The Charge of the Light Brigade, one of the most famous and tragic military blunders in history, occurred during the Crimean War in 1854 in what is known as the Charge of the Light Brigade. This incident, often used to illustrate the futility of military miscommunication, is remembered as an example of heroism, but also as one of the most avoidable disasters in military history. The British Army, alongside its French and Ottoman allies, was engaged in a siege of Russian forces at Sevastopol, Crimea. The British had sent in their cavalry, the Light Brigade, under the command of Lord Cardigan, to engage Russian artillery that had been firing on the British positions. However, the order to charge was based on a grave misunderstanding. The order came from Lord Raglan, the British commander, who had intended for the Light Brigade to target Russian artillery that was positioned to the rear of the Russian forces. However, due to a communication error, the Light Brigade misunderstood the order and charged directly into the Russian artillery line at the front of the Russian position, which was heavily fortified and defended. The result was disastrous. With only 600 men, the Light Brigade rode straight into a wall of artillery and musket fire. The Russians were well prepared, and the charge led to the deaths of over 100 soldiers, with many others severely wounded. Despite their bravery, the charge was futile, and the Russians maintained their position. The charge has since been immortalized as an example of courage and honor, but also as a monumental failure in leadership and communication. It was a mistake born from poor orders and a misunderstanding that led to the needless loss of life. The charge of the Light Brigade became an enduring symbol of the cost of miscommunication in warfare, and it remains a poignant reminder of the importance of clarity in military command.